If you look at the venture capital and private equity firms that were investing in FTX, and they didn't look at compliance, or at least they just took the word of the founder or FTX. They never went in and actually did the checks if the compliance was actually there, because they were heavily marketing themselves as, we are the most compliant exchange. He was on Capitol Hill talking to the American regulators, trying to lobby, pro-regulation. So people had the idea that they're the poster boy for the most compliant exchange, which ended up not being the case at all. And the private equity firms and the venture capital firms were, mocked for their lack of due diligence that they did. And I think a lot of them today, if they are offered another opportunity to invest in one of those crypto exchanges, I bet you that compliance becomes, one of the key factors that they're going to look for. So the next generation of, let's say, financial services, fintech, crypto businesses, if they want to raise capital, compliance is going to be one of the areas that is going to be looked at. So my name is Jooseph Vahtras. I am what you would maybe call a compliance expert or a compliance professional. Currently a unrestricted free agent, but until very recently I was working in Chainalysis, which is a blockchain analytics company, as a compliance advisory lead, and I've been in the industry working on various different financial crime prevention, AML compliance roles for the past 9 years. So. Yeah, that's what I identify myself as in terms of like my professional career. Yeah, that's a good question. I do get that question quite a bit, because my education is not necessarily related to compliance as such. It was a bit of a coincidence. So I worked in a currency exchange company in Denmark, Estonian company here in Denmark. And that was a very interesting company, because we did not only physical currency or the counter to normal people, tourists, but also wholesale. So we were supplying the other currency exchange offices here in Copenhagen, and we did investment gold. So very interesting let's say, line of business. And this is, late 2013, early 2014, where compliance is not really that exciting. Companies, obviously, they have obligations in that regard to prevent financial crime, but it's not as prominent as it is today, or how prominent it became in 2018. So in this is the time when the Danish Financial Services Authorities is putting increased pressure on money service businesses. Banks are trying to look at their portfolio, seeing, okay, do they have any exposure to these MSBs? And they start increasing their monitoring, asking different questions, and this is where we recognized in Tavex that we need to step up our game in that regard. And even though I wasn't tasked with designing the new compliance procedures as a cashier, obviously I had to carry out these policies in operationally, right? So that was the initial contact to AML, and I started looking at it and I was like, okay, this is pretty interesting. And then some of my friends that I've known for a while now started a venture called Coinify, the cryptocurrency payment processor here in Denmark. And they needed some help in that regard. So they asked me if I would be interested in joining them, and I started as an onboarding associate there. So this was my first real job in that area of compliance, of financial crime prevention. And that role quickly became into me becoming a compliance officer, and then I was hooked, and I've been in the industry ever since. So a bit of a coincidence, but yeah, I've been enjoying it and still going strong. Well, I mean, you're talking to a compliance expert or a professional, so I would say, of course, no, right? But I do I can see why someone would say that. So, obviously, it doesn't bring you any business. actually it sort of stops you from doing business with some customers. It's a cost, it consumes resources, both on human resources, also potentially, you need to buy some additional technology, and the opportunity cost of doing compliance versus maybe developing your product and increasing your business. So I can understand why someone would say that. But, the analogy that maybe it's not the best analogy, but I like it. It's sort of like having brakes on your car, right? So the brakes don't make the car go any faster. Actually, it makes it probably slower because of the weight. It costs, the cost of brakes will increase the price of the car, and the regulators, you wouldn't be allowed to drive a car that doesn't have any brakes on it, right? So, but at the same time, it allows you to be in control. And that's the main thing, right? So people don't see the value of compliance until it's late, until it's too late. So, compliance helps organizations, like I said, to be in control, to navigate any sort of potential difficult situations that they shouldn't be in. And if you, for example, if we look at I'm an Estonian, living in Denmark, the Estonia Danske Bank situation was close to my heart. When I look back and some of the, let's say, the issues that Danske Bank had, or their, let's say, the decision of not spending money to bring the Baltic branches onto the group-wide compliance program, is probably a decision that they, in retrospect, now regret. The cost that they, at the time, evaluated to be too high, in retrospect today is probably very small compared to the legal fees, the consultancy fees, the fines that they need to pay, the PR nightmare that came out of it. So I think if they had the chance to redo that, they would probably decide to go back and do it. So I think that's unfortunate that compliance is always viewed in that regard, because it doesn't also get the recognition it deserves often, right? Because if it works well, you don't really see it, right? It's something that runs in the background, and as long as it keeps your name out of newspapers, it does its job. But it's hard to put a monetary or appreciate it as well as maybe business development or some of the sales functions. So I guess the most difficult part of fighting financial crime or preventing financial crime from happening or money laundering from happening is the fact that the criminals only represent a very small subset of your customers, or the general population for that matter, right? So identifying, this small percentage out of the sea of legitimate customers is somewhat difficult. And, in some cases, a lot of these sort of controls that are put in place may burden the normal users or the normal customers that you have, the totally legitimate customers. So in that case, probably the identification part is the most difficult part. So how do we figure out who are the bad guys in the sea of good guys, right? And that's why we have all these customer due diligence methods on finding out who may be, let's say, trying to launder money or use the financial system for illicit purposes. So yeah, I guess the most difficult part is identification, finding out who they are. Yeah, it is difficult, and I don't necessarily have the right answer how to do it. The way I've been looking at it is exactly sort of highlighting the fact that what is the cost if we get it wrong, right? You think that this costs a lot now, or this is a burden now. Think what happens if we end up on the front page of a newspaper if something goes wrong, right? So that's one way of trying to convey the message internally. But yeah, it's not easy, and also from a personal perspective. Often in organizations, compliance professionals don't get the recognition, perhaps what they deserve, right? In maybe your team lead or the head of your team will obviously recognize you for the good work that you have done, but generally in financial institutions, it's the commercial functions that are more sort of always recognized, rewarded for their good job of bringing in new business, while the compliance professionals are often, on the background somewhere, and when it works and everything is going well, it's just not that visible. So, the risk management or the risk and compliance roles in financial institutions. So the key is obviously, like I mentioned earlier, the difficulty also what you asked is, first of all, identifying who these criminals are, and then trying to disrupt their financial flows. So first of all, they need to identify who might be a criminal or a potential criminal. Once they have identified that, then they will try to disrupt these funds by, either not allowing them access to the financial system, by blocking accounts, not conducting transactions, but also in some cases freezing or seizing those assets. So if there's a clear indication of money laundering or sanctions evasion, for example, then financial institutions can take the action of freezing or seizing the funds and then handing them over to the law enforcement. And obviously, another part of it is then reporting any suspicious activity. So in cases where there hasn't been proven sort of financial crime yet, but there's suspicion of it, they would report that to the law enforcement, and then law enforcement can take that information and then investigate further and potentially prosecute some of these bad actors. So identifying, disrupting, and then helping to report to the law enforcement in order to then prosecute them and bring to justice. So I think these are the main areas. I don't know if this is fair, but there's a saying among compliance professionals that everything is fair in war, love, and AML. Often GDPR takes a backseat to AML because financial crime prevention is a more pressing issue. Obviously, GDPR is a factor in that, and there are rules around it. But for example, if you look at the information or record-keeping requirements that the AML regulation stipulates, it's 5 years. So if a transaction has happened, the financial institutions need to keep records for 5 years, which is not the case. With GDPR, I think it's, I might be wrong here, but I think it's 6 months that normally you keep the customer records when you need to delete them. So financial institutions are not necessarily within they don't have the same obligations, so they can keep the information longer. They actually have to keep the information longer. So AML precedes GDPR in some ways. Right. I think so. In that regard, financial institutions play a very important role, right? Education is a key word here, to understand some of these typologies or methodologies, how these criminals operate, right? So, scam and fraud is a very big area, and understanding like what are the methods that criminals use, and educating your customers in that regard, I think could go a long way. When I worked in the currency exchange office, we also did money remittances. So you have romance scams. Someone is convinced that they have a loved one somewhere in another country, and they want to send money to them. And even if you ask questions directly from the customer saying, hey, have you ever met this lady? You're sending quite a lot of money, to a foreign country that you have no apparent reason to. And actually customers get, fairly agitated. I mean, that you're questioning, let's say their love, or potentially, that they think they have a relationship with this person. And you ask these questions, and with a quick Google search, they have a sheet printed out. You can see that it's a known scam that some of these guys are perpetrating, right? So in that case, it becomes very uncomfortable for both parties, because you're trying to save the customer some money and not doing the transaction, and he's just furious with you because he's convinced that this person needs help from him, and he wants to provide that. So doing that, it can be difficult sometimes, but I think that's one way. Now we have seen also a rise in a new type of a scam, which is more on the crypto side of things, is is what they call pig butchering. So it's a funny name, but essentially what it means is folks will start reaching out to you on WhatsApp and different messaging platforms, and they win your trust over by not necessarily offering or asking for money in the beginning. So it's a very sort of long play, if you will. So they win your trust over, they start speaking to you just randomly, hey, how are you? They're very personable and very relatable, so people normally start trusting them, and they don't necessarily pressure them to buy anything or to invest in anything. What they do is they mention some of these things in passing and say, hey, I'm in a great beach resort somewhere in Mexico or in some exclusive destinations. And then just mentioning in passing, maybe if you're wondering how I can afford this is, I dabble in crypto, for example, or I have an uncle who is an investment manager and they invest in crypto, and, I've been making, 10x on my investments for the past year or two, but they're not necessarily saying, hey, you need to invest in here. So they're playing the game in the sense of trying to build some sort of trust and then showing how well they live, and then passingly offering the help is like, if you want, I can introduce my uncle to you, and he can take a chat with you and how you can potentially also make your money work for you, so to speak. And because of it's so elaborate, it takes so long time, that they're more trusting. So we have had, or not me personally, but we have seen cases, where victims hand over millions of dollars, and in some cases, it's extremely, let's say, difficult to even read some of these cases where some folks have parents that are sick and they're writing to the person saying, hey, I hope this is safe, because if I lose this money, I don't know what to do, because I need to pay the medical bills of my father, and they still ask and go through with this and clean out the victims totally. So they're always, like, fraud is probably one of these areas that always evolves. Like, they always find these new ways of doing it. The good old tech helpline, you get a call from Microsoft and you need to give access to your computer, and suddenly, either they use those credentials to then log on to your net bank, or they use some other type of scheme. So I think education in those areas is key. And also, in the crypto industry, one thing that can be done is, outgoing transactions to known scam wallets can be actually stopped. So if crypto exchanges are pre-screening the destination wallet, and they find out that this is, belongs to a scam cluster, they can actually stop that transaction and then contact the customer and say, hey, you're about to send funds to this. We can't stop you from doing it, but, we have reason to believe that you're probably not going to see your money again if you go through with this transaction. So there are things that financial institutions can do to empower the users, not to hand over their money to the criminals. Yeah. Well, my point is that probably it already has. I think we discussed earlier a little bit about technology and AI, right? So one way of looking at it is, if you can reduce some of the resources that you're currently using in looking at some of these, let's say, false positive alerts or some of the repetitive tasks that adds no value, and if you can do that better with the use of technology, not only do you reduce your bottom line cost, but you can also start doing it better than the competition, right? More effectively, and actually use that as an advantage. And I think another very important area after the whole FTX debacle, the cryptocurrency exchange that went bust, it's been discussed ad nauseum, and I don't want to sort of do that even further, but I think it teaches us a lesson a little bit, right? So if you look at the venture capital and private equity firms that were investing in FTX, and they didn't look at compliance, or at least they just took the word of the founder or FTX, they never went in and actually did the checks if the compliance was actually there, because they were heavily marketing themselves as, we are the most compliant exchange, he was on Capitol Hill talking to the American regulators, trying to lobby, pro-regulation. So people had the idea that they're the poster boy for the most compliant exchange, which ended up not being the case at all. And the private equity firms and the venture capital firms were, mocked for their lack of due diligence that they did. And I think a lot of them today, if they are offered another opportunity to invest in one of those crypto exchanges, I bet you that compliance becomes, one of the key factors that they're going to look for. So the next generation of, let's say, financial services, fintech, crypto businesses, if they want to raise capital, compliance is going to be one of the areas that is going to be looked at. So if you want to raise capital in a most efficient way, and obviously capital equals opportunity to develop good services, products, expansion and so forth. So in order to attract that capital, you need to have strong compliance and AML processes in place. So that is the I think which would be the next frontier, or the next time right now the market is in a downward slope, so the investments in that area has dried up a little bit. But once we go back into the bull market or a cycle where investments are flowing in, I think you would see heavy focus on how good is the compliance procedures in those fintechs and crypto exchanges, for example. Yeah, I think use of technology is probably the key word here. So I've done quite a few conferences in the past year, and one thing that you keep hearing quite a bit is use of AI in, for example, transaction monitoring. And it seems to have some, let's say, promising future, because one thing that financial institutions are really let's say, plagued with is this phenomena of false positives. So what we often see is, the old rule-based transaction monitoring will look at, you set a rule and then, you get alerted, but often it creates a lot of false positives. What ends up happening is that the compliance professionals are spending their time in looking at these false positives and not actually being able to spend time on stuff that really matters, or that matters the most. So AI seems to have quite promising ability to weed out some of the false positives. So, using AI in transaction monitoring would at least could help to identify those criminals much easier, much faster, and doing that with less resources. So, which would give companies some of their, let's say, the competitive advantage again in that area, so they can reduce cost in the compliance area by use of technology, because currently it's been very human resource heavy. So a lot of the financial institutions have just thrown people at the problem. So, but I think now with the use of technology, we can move, perhaps in a more resource efficient way of dealing with this, and the compliance professionals can then use their time on actually more important things than looking at false positives.